For years, the story of China's economic rise has been told in superlatives. The largest construction booms in human history, the biggest cities built in the shortest times, the fastest escape from poverty on a national scale. What began as a series of cautious market reforms in the 1980s exploded into 3 decades of relentless expansion, catapulting the People's Republic from rural isolation to global industrial titan. But now, the story is changing. The headlines have shifted. Growth has slowed, debt is soaring, youth are unemployed, buildings sit empty, and the whispers have begun. Is China on the verge of collapse? That word, collapse, is thrown around too easily, especially when it comes to countries we perceive as rivals. But the truth is more complicated, more unsettling, and in many ways, more dangerous. Because China isn't collapsing. It's calcifying, slowing, tightening, a superpower with cracks beneath its marble exterior. And what happens next may not be a fall, but a long, hard freeze. To understand where China stands today, we have to rewind. The roots of its growth go back to the late 1970s, when Deng Xiaoping began dismantling Mao's command economy. The old rigid system gave way to something new, state-led capitalism. It was a peculiar hybrid. The Communist Party would retain absolute control, but markets would drive wealth creation, and for decades, that bet paid off. From 1980 to 2010, China's GDP exploded by more than 10% per year. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty. Entire cities sprouted from farmland in months. Factories churned out everything from cheap toys to cutting-edge electronics. And Western investors, eager to tap into a billion-person market, poured in capital. It was, in every sense, an economic miracle. But the fuel for that miracle had a shelf life. Much of the growth came not from innovation or productivity, but from relentless infrastructure building, exports, and property development. Local governments, rewarded for hitting GDP targets, borrowed heavily to fund white elephant projects, massive roads, railways, and cities, some of which remain eerily empty. And when the real estate sector took over as the primary engine of growth, the system became even more fragile. The problem is staggering in scope. Real estate in China isn't just a sector, it's the sector. At its peak, it accounted for nearly 30% of GDP. Developers borrowed against future sales. Families poured their life savings into unfinished homes. And local governments, barred from raising taxes, sold land to developers to keep the cash flowing. It was a self-reinforcing loop, until it wasn't. When major developers like Evergrande defaulted on their debt, the shockwaves rippled through the economy. Suddenly, millions of people who had paid up front for homes found themselves holding empty promises. Construction halted, protests flared, and consumer confidence, already shaken by the pandemic, collapsed. But it doesn't stop there. China is facing a quadruple economic threat: a slowing economy, a property crisis, ballooning debt, and a demographic time bomb. Youth unemployment has surged above 20%. The hukou system, China's internal passport system, traps rural migrants in urban poverty, preventing them from accessing services in the cities where they live and work. And then there's the debt. By most estimates, China's total debt, when you add up corporate, household, and government liabilities, exceeds 300% of GDP. That's higher than the US, and dangerously close to levels seen in debt-saddled nations like Japan or Italy. Local governments alone owe over $9 trillion, much of it hidden through off-balance sheet vehicles. As growth slows, these debts become harder to service, and the government faces an unenviable choice: print more money, risking inflation, or default, risking social unrest. But here's the twist. Unlike most democracies, China can absorb pain differently. Its central government controls the banks, the media, the courts, and the currency. It can extend lifelines to failing companies, mask economic data, and suppress dissent. And it has the largest foreign currency reserves in the world, over $3.4 trillion. That gives Beijing enormous room to maneuver, at least in the short term. While Western central banks are hiking interest rates to combat inflation, China is going the other way, cutting rates, injecting liquidity, and praying that a rebound will follow. The hope is that by bailing out unfinished housing projects and encouraging consumer spending, they can prevent the entire system from seizing up. But this is a short-term fix. The real problems are structural. One of those problems is demographics. China's one-child policy, in place for decades, has left the country aging rapidly. Fewer workers, more retirees. An economy that once thrived on youthful labor now faces a shrinking, older population. By 2050, nearly one-third of Chinese citizens will be over 60. And unlike wealthier nations, China hasn't had time to grow rich before it grew old. There's a temptation here to compare China to Japan. After all, Japan also had an overinflated housing market, aging demographics, and a manufacturing-based economy. It entered its own lost decades of stagnation in the 1990s. But this is where the comparison ends. Japan stagnated after it had already become wealthy. China, by contrast, still has a per capita income far below Western nations. The average Chinese citizen is still far from middle class by global standards. If growth stalls now, it won't be a rich country growing slowly. It will be a poor country stuck. And unlike Japan, China doesn't have democratic safety valves. Its people can't vote out their leaders. If discontent brews, it doesn't trickle through ballots. It erupts. That brings us to the issue of corruption. Corruption in China has long been tolerated as the cost of doing business. A few bribes here, a few favors there. It greased the wheels of rapid development. But as the economy slows, the corruption becomes more toxic. There are fewer opportunities for easy profits, so officials turn inward, stealing from public funds, exploiting vulnerable citizens, tightening their grip. This breeds resentment, and in a system with no democratic outlet, resentment is dangerous. Still, predictions of collapse are premature. What China faces is not a sudden implosion, but a long, grinding plateau. Growth will slow, protests will rise, but be crushed. Consumers will grow cautious, investment will pull back, and the country that once dreamed of overtaking the US may settle into a role that's powerful but no longer ascendant. So why all the panic? Why the headlines declaring imminent collapse? Part of it is misinformation. Content creators, eager for clicks, amplify worst-case scenarios. Videos with thumbnails like 34 days until China collapses go viral, not because they're accurate, but because they're seductive. They appeal to the fantasy that if we just wait long enough, the bad guys will fall apart, that somehow we'll be proven right. But geopolitics isn't a comic book, and China's collapse wouldn't be a triumph. It would be a tragedy. Because like it or not, our economies are intertwined. China is a major buyer of raw materials from Australia, Brazil, and Africa. It's a critical manufacturer for the US and Europe. It keeps global inflation in check by exporting cheap goods. If China were to truly collapse, overnight, with no warning, the ripple effects would be catastrophic. Stock markets would crash, supply chains would snap, recessions would spread like wildfire. And that's just the economics. A weakened China wouldn't usher in democracy. It would likely see a power vacuum, rising nationalism, military escalation, and a potential crackdown even more brutal than what exists today. Authoritarian regimes don't collapse into liberal utopias. They collapse into chaos. So, what should we hope for? Not collapse, not stagnation, but a transformation, a slow, painful shift toward openness, toward transparency, toward trust. China is not monolithic. It's a nation of 1.4 billion people, many of whom want the same things we do: security, dignity, opportunity. They are not our enemies. They are our neighbors in a global system that can only work if the pillars hold. That's the real story. Not a fall, but a reckoning. Not an ending, but a turning point. China's ruthless economy isn't dying. It's mutating. And how the world responds, how we adapt, compete, and cooperate will shape not just China's future, but our own. What do you think? Is China heading toward collapse, or simply entering a new economic phase? Should the world root for reform, or prepare for fallout? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if you found this breakdown eye-opening, and subscribe for more high-stakes global stories they don't want you to think too deeply about.